Welcome to Supply Chain in around 60 seconds and the second episode in this series on Scope 3 emissions in the supply chain. We've just dealt with the history and context of the reason for sustainability reporting, and now we're going to go into the definitions of Scope 1, 2 and 3 with a particular focus on Scope 3. We will then go into much deeper detail around how you can see these emissions in the supply chain using a network diagram, and I'll provide a short case study of how this could impact the way you make decisions in the supply chain. Thank you for watching. You are probably familiar with the diagram on the left. It shows how Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions appear inside the value chain. For this presentation, we're just really focusing in on Scope 3 and parts 4 and 9. You see, Scope 3 has 15 different parts to it, so it's easy to understand why many businesses are saying it's very complicated to report on Scope 3. However, it appears, and we'll get to this very shortly, that many of the stock exchanges are allowing businesses to at least explain why they can't do all of Scope 3 emissions reporting. However, let's first consider the scope of what we're talking about. Scope 3 emissions are said to represent roughly 80% of all emissions in a company's value chain. And within that Scope 3 emissions, roughly 15% is generated by 0.4 upstream transportation and distribution and 0.9 downstream transportation and distribution. So it pays then for businesses to focus in on these two, again for these points that are being made by the different stock exchanges using phrases such as disclose and justify any specific exclusions when it comes to Scope 3. Well, if you're getting transportation reports today, it'll be difficult to justify why you can't do your carbon reporting. And that statement where feasible to do your Scope 3 emissions reporting, again for points 4 and 9, if you're getting transportation logistics reports, then it potentially is feasible for you to do that. And I'll explain why. So here's a detailed definition of 0.4, upstream transportation and distribution. You can pause and read it, but I think in a network diagram, it makes a lot more sense. So generally speaking, and this is just an example, it's from all the transportation and the nodes as the goods move from origin through their domestic freight at origin, the international freight portion. 0.9, pause here, and you can read this in detail about downstream. Well, that can be defined as well in a network diagram as everything from that point of entry into the country of home consumption and through the different nodes, including, and as you can see here, a domestic distribution network as well. So you will have to develop over time emissions factors for the different 3PLs, distribution centers, warehouses, regional distribution centers, so on and so forth, that you do have in your supply chain. But end to end, typically, generally speaking, Scope 4 and 9 looks like this, and you'll recognize this from a network diagram of your supply chain, which you probably have. If not, this is very easy to create and a great way of mapping where emissions could be coming from. And this is why you probably agree with me when I say obtaining these reports, just shipping reports, which you'll be getting today. And so it is feasible that you can then translate those shipping reports and the data from them into carbon emissions reports for the supply chain in a quite straightforward way. So let's have a talk about this from the context of a made-up case study, but where you could begin to become challenged in the way that the supply chain operates and greenhouse gas emissions in a way that it hasn't happened before. So if we're talking about a listed company today, they may have this as a supply chain for their freight factory based in China, and they may decide, well, we're going to do China plus one, so we're going to take that factory and relocate it to a new country, India. As you can say, everything else stays exactly the same, except for the fact that the raw materials have to stay in China. That's just typically what's occurring at the moment, and now these goods have to move via ocean, not just via truck. So on one side, the company gets 3 ticks. They've supply chain resilience, cost per unit may stay the same or reduce, and let's just assume they're compliant, trade compliance, internal compliance, etc. However, because of those extra legs and maybe the extra distance now, because the goods are coming from India, the greenhouse gas emissions have increased. Now, they could be justified because of these changes in the annual report. However, because of these groups, which we discussed in episode 1, there will need to be a way of ensuring that you are targeting the emissions and working on real ways to bring them down. So that will require quantitative analysis. Now, we do know that listed companies have revenue targets, whether they create them themselves or whether or not it's the different stock exchanges or Wall Street predicts they're going to hit certain revenues at quarter end, and that could impact the share price. So typically what we've seen in the past is a company may convert certain amount of freight to air freight to get that cargo in sooner to be in the country of home consumption, so it can be counted in the revenue for that quarter. Typically, there are many people in the businesses whose bonuses are attached to it, and if the stock price goes up, then they've got certain remuneration attached to that as well. Well, this is going to increase the emissions significantly for the supply chain, and that too will have to be reported. Again, let's just go back to this triumvirate here. So businesses may have to consider how they adjust their supply chain practices and how they're connected to finance, not just from a numbers, dollars and cents perspective, but also now greenhouse gas emissions. That may apply to you. Thank you for watching this episode, but what does this all mean practically speaking? Well, in episode 3, we go into that and discuss how companies that didn't consider that they needed to do Scope 3 reporting emissions yet have been caught up in these requirements. So, how do you respond as opposed to react? That's answered in episode 3, and I look forward to seeing you there.